5% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports into the US are now turning into a key point in President Trump's trade war as US and Chinese officials meet in Switzerland this weekend. The vast plains of America's heartland, once symbols of boundless opportunity, have become flashpoints in a trade war that many farmers did not foresee when the Trump administration first imposed steep tariffs on imported steel, aluminum, and various Chinese goods. This set off a domino effect that spread through global supply chains. China, the largest buyer of US agricultural exports, retaliated almost immediately by imposing duties of up to 125% on soybeans, along with similar rates on pork, dairy products, and tree nuts. These actions were not merely economic responses, they directly affected the livelihoods of US farmers, who saw foreign orders disappear and domestic prices fall. The agricultural sector, a cornerstone of rural America's identity and a significant political constituency, found itself caught between the president's promise to fight unfair trade practices and the harsh reality of lost income and growing inventories. Tariffs first impacted US agricultural goods in April 2018, when China imposed 15 to 25% tariffs on 94 agricultural product lines, including pork, fruit, and tree nuts. By July of that year, these tariffs expanded to cover nearly 700 product lines, and by September 2019, the list had grown to over 1,000, with tariffs as high as 80% on some commodities. The administration's response was swift but complicated. The USDA's Market Facilitation Program, MFP, allocated $23 billion in direct payments to support farm incomes, mainly focusing on non-specialty and specialty crops, as well as dairy and pork. Additionally, the Food Purchase and Distribution Program bought surplus commodities to distribute domestically, while a $200 million trade promotion program aimed to open new markets abroad. These stopgap measures reflected the administration's recognition that tariffs alone could not sustain the agricultural economy, even though they introduced new distortions in planting decisions and commodity prices. Soybeans, a major casualty of the Sino-American trade war, saw US exports to China drop by more than 70% in the early months of retaliation, as China shifted its purchases to Brazil. US soybean farmers were left with growing inventories and falling prices. A study by the Cato Institute noted that exports to China dropped by 77%, resulting in substantial losses for producers who had spent years building relationships and infrastructure to serve that market. At the same time, soybean crush facilities in the Midwest reported reduced output, and the domestic crush spread narrowed, squeezing profit margins. Although a University of California Davis analysis later found that farmers received $5.4 billion more in aid than they lost in price impacts, the emotional toll of market uncertainty and the risk of ongoing trade barriers left many farmers concerned about future disruptions. Specialty crops, such as fruits, nuts, and vegetables, which rely heavily on high-value export markets, fared no better. For instance, California almond growers, who in 2022 exported $4.7 billion worth of product, saw Chinese tariffs of 145% wipe out key outlets almost overnight. As Beijing imposed retaliatory tariffs of 125%, this led to a glut of domestic almonds and a price crash from $2.50 to $1.40 per pound, according to the University of California Giannini Foundation of Agricultural Economics. In Washington state, the geoduck clam industry, once a niche export worth hundreds of millions of dollars to coastal communities, halted production as orders from China disappeared. Indigenous divers, who had relied on China's demand for the giant clams, saw Canadian suppliers step in to fill the void at a fraction of the cost, exposing vulnerable supply chains and regional disparities in the agricultural sector. Corn, a staple of US agricultural exports, also faced challenges. Illinois farmers, who had long relied on Mexico's robust demand for high-yield hybrids, watched anxiously as tariffs threatened to redirect trade to South American competitors. With nearly 40% of US corn exports previously going to Mexico, any reduction in this trade posed a significant risk to revenue. The threat of higher tariffs led grain handlers to adjust logistics, favoring rail shipments to alternative ports and reducing bids at inland markets. At the same time, survey data showed that some corn growers began shifting acreage to less export-sensitive crops, like sorghum, which offered lower input costs and drought resilience. Quick planting decisions can change when tariff-induced uncertainties collide with agronomic realities and input costs. Essential to crop production, fertilizers, seeds, and farm machinery were not immune to the fallout. Tariffs on Canadian products threatened 25% duties on potash fertilizer, a crucial nutrient for crops like corn, sending spot prices soaring as dealers hoarded inventory. Although a temporary exemption was granted until April 2025, the mere threat forced many cooperatives to raise forward prices, compelling farmers to reconsider their spring fertilizer applications or face higher costs. At the same time, import duties on tractors, combines, and replacement parts pushed equipment prices higher, prompting some operations to delay upgrades, extend service intervals, or even ration field hours during planting and harvest. These measures, intended to protect domestic industries, inadvertently imposed a hidden tax on farm productivity. The human cost of these pressures was seen in a surge of farm bankruptcies and financial distress. Analysis by Food and Water Watch found that small and independent farms were disproportionately affected during the first round of tariffs, with bankruptcies rising 24% between 2018 and 2019. Larger farming conglomerates often weathered downturns better, thanks to greater access to credit and off-farm income, while smaller operations, especially those outside corporate supply chains, struggled to service debt. The initial $28 billion bailout, primarily distributed through the MFP, saw an average of $183,000 go to the top 1% of recipients, while the bottom 80% received less than $5,000. This uneven distribution exacerbated existing inequalities within rural communities, fueling criticism that relief from the trade war favored large-scale agribusinesses over family farms. Within this turbulent landscape, minority and underrepresented farmers faced unique challenges. Black farmers, already confronting systemic barriers to land ownership, credit, and technical assistance, found the volatile tariff environment especially dangerous. Less than 2% of US farms are black-owned, but this small group was hit hard by sudden market closures and uncertainty over future aid programs. John Boyd Jr., president of the National Black Farmers Association, reported that many members hesitated to plant spring crops, uncertain whether another round of tariffs would erase anticipated profits. Despite USDA assurances of equitable support, lingering distrust and legal challenges to past equity initiatives left many minority farmers skeptical that federal relief would reach them effectively. In response to mounting pressures, the federal government mobilized a range of support programs. The Market Facilitation Program distributed $23 billion in payments between 2018 and 2020, with 90% directed towards specialty crop producers. The Food Purchase and Distribution Program acquired roughly $2.3 billion in surplus commodities, pork, dairy, and produce, to stabilize domestic markets and supply food banks. Meanwhile, the Agricultural Trade Promotion Program allocated $200 million to help exporters identify new buyers in Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. However, these interventions, structured as one-time fixes for specific trade shocks, offered little assurance against future tariff spikes and were criticized for adding to federal deficits and diverting funds from long-term investments in research, infrastructure, and climate resilience. Faced with ongoing uncertainty, many producers turned to adaptive strategies. Sorghum acreage in the Great Plains rose by roughly 4% as farmers sought a crop less reliant on volatile export markets and more tolerant of adverse weather. Similarly, some Midwestern operators experimented with cover crops and reduced tillage systems to lower input costs and reduce soil erosion. Grain merchants, anticipating excess supplies, offered deferred pricing contracts, enabling growers to lock in sales 6 months ahead, though at narrower margins. Others diversified into livestock or specialty products like organic grains, hoping to tap into domestic niche markets. These shifts demonstrate the agricultural sector's resilience, but also highlight the fragility of business models built on predictable trade relationships. Beyond the US heartland, global competitors seized opportunities. Brazil, already the world's leading soybean supplier, captured over 70% of China's demand, cementing new export infrastructure and long-term distribution channels. Washington state seafood exporters faced competition from Canada. Geoduck farmers have stepped in to fill the gap left by higher US duties, while European greenhouse operators have secured markets for lettuce and berries previously served by American growers. These developments suggest that even if tariffs eventually decrease, rebuilding market share and trust could take years, if not decades. The trade war weakened America's competitive position in some of its most profitable agricultural sectors, raising questions about the long-term cost-benefit calculus of unilateral tariff campaigns. Politically, Trump's base among rural voters showed a combination of steadfast loyalty and growing frustration. Surveys indicated that many farmers continued to support the president's broader agenda on immigration and deregulation, even as they expressed concern about the tariff-induced pain. Local farm bureaus held emergency meetings, and some county extension offices organized webinars to help navigate market disruptions and federal aid applications. Meanwhile, industry groups such as the American Farm Bureau Federation and National Corn Growers Association publicly urged negotiators to secure permanent tariff relief and include agriculture in comprehensive trade agreements. The trade war revealed a paradox. Farmers supported the administration's aggressive stance on trade, but were frustrated by the collateral damage to their livelihoods. Looking ahead, the lasting effects of Trump's tariffs on agriculture remain uncertain. Supply chain disruptions can damage customer relationships and undermine the reliability of US exports, while emergency bailouts set expectations for future government intervention. The so-called Liberation Day tariffs, criticized for their sudden imposition, underscore how quickly policy shifts can impact commodity markets, farm finance, and rural communities. Current debates over the USMCA's agricultural provisions, as well as ongoing negotiations with the EU and Southeast Asian partners, will test the US's ability to rebuild trust and diversify export destinations. As environmental challenges, like droughts and floods, intensify, the sector's ability to adapt will depend on stable, predictable trade frameworks rather than episodic protectionism. The past few years have demonstrated resilience under pressure. Farmers who once relied on traditional financing are now exploring digital marketplaces, blockchain-enabled traceability, and value-added cooperatives to mitigate future shocks. Research institutions are increasing efforts to breed climate-resilient crops and sustainable livestock systems. However, these innovations can only thrive in an environment of consistent market access and fair competition. If the US aims to remain a global agricultural leader, policymakers must balance the appeal of punitive tariffs with investments in diplomacy, infrastructure, and equitable support for all producers, large and small, black and white, commodity, and specialty alike. The lessons learned from this era of trade turbulence will shape farming for decades to come. The global cotton market underwent significant changes as American cotton, once central to US textile exports to China, sought new destinations. Studies by Lowe and Hudson showed that Chinese tariffs, which peaked at 25–35% on raw cotton and carded fibers, would reduce US cotton exports by approximately 0.16% annually through the 2028-29 marketing year, with price reductions averaging 0.58% per year. However, rather than disappearing, much of this cotton was rerouted to countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and India, which import US cotton duty-free and process it into yarn and fabric for re-export to China. This diversion weakened the cost advantages that US growers had built through decades of quality improvements and infrastructure investments, effectively transforming cotton-growing regions like Texas, Mississippi, and Georgia into bystanders in a trade dynamic they once dominated. The long-term consequence is the fragmentation of supply chains, with mills in Asia now sourcing preferentially from regions closer to home, while US producers face narrower margins and the challenge of finding alternative markets. Wheat exporters also face challenges as China revised its tariff rate quotas, TRQs, and imposed punitive duties on US shipments. According to the US Wheat Associates, Beijing's adjustments to its TRQ administration in 2024 created thresholds that funneled most wheat imports through state-owned enterprises, sidelining American suppliers in favor of Australian and Canadian counterparts. At the same time, China's broader retaliatory measures on $22 billion worth of US goods, including an immediate 15 to 25% levy on wheat and milling products, dampened American export volumes in early 2025, even as other markets grew.